Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for our webinar. So our webinar is going to be focused on bringing your cloud costs back down to earth. And we're going to be exploring some financially sensible approaches to cloud adoption. Very quick introduction to DMW. So we're a part of the Credera group. We provide three primary services: advisory, delivery, and engineering across financial services, energy, and commercial and public sector. In three technology areas: cloud, data, and digital. And we're proud partners of each of the major cloud providers and many other technology partners as well. So I'm Rob. I'm a principal with DMW, and I've been with DMW for about 3 years now. I specialize in cloud architecture, predominantly Azure, but also tinker occasionally with AWS and GCP. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Rob. I'm James Breeze. I lead our cloud practice at DMW, and that includes our partnerships with Microsoft, AWS, and Google. My background's mainly in data center migration to private and increasingly public cloud in enterprise clients. So I'll kick off today, and I thought we'd start with a quote. So I guess the size of the problem in the cloud market and the opportunity for cost savings. So interesting quote from Gartner. So nearly 260 billion is the size of the cloud services market forecast for 2020, with only 6.3% growth, which I thought was a little small, but then we're living in interesting times at the moment. But even so, thinking back to my early days in a project for a manufacturer, there was a VP of manufacturing at the time who didn't like IT because IT underutilized their assets. So in manufacturing, he ran his infrastructure at 90%, producing products. IT ran at 10%, and in his point of view, was a waste of money in investing in. Move forward to today, we're much better at, I guess, asset utilization in IT with virtualization that's been going on for the past at least decade. And then now moving that into the cloud onto somebody else's computer brings some new and interesting challenges around controlling cost. So what's the opportunity for cost savings? So we've split this into, I suppose, two areas. One is direct, where your cost savings are driven by using the technology that cloud provides. And the second is indirect, where it enables your business to do newer or different or cleverer things that can drive, I suppose, more growth or more profit or other things indirectly related to IT cost. Moving to cloud is not necessarily cheaper, and that's, I suppose, a common misconception. The headline rates may look cheaper for renting a computer by an hour or so, but when you scale that up, if you're doing a like-for-like data center migration and paying hourly for equivalent services, it can be more expensive if you don't take some action. So some of the typical direct ones: capex to opex. So rather than investing in infrastructure and depreciate it over a period of time, you pay for those services as they're consumed. This can be a beneficial financial model to a variety of organizations, and sometimes is the primary driver for moving to a cloud model. Automation means things can be done more quickly or maybe even with less people. Platform as a service along a similar thread. It's, I suppose, moving up the technology stack and providing a bigger scale than there ever has been of outsourcing of IT support for common services to major providers. Over on the indirect side, so time to market, you can deploy things quicker, more geographically. So today, within minutes, you can deploy infrastructure in any part of the world, in China or the US or anywhere. It's incredible the reach that these hyperscale cloud providers have and the ease of access. Dynamic scalability, having spent time working for a number of retailers, just the ability to have almost limitless compute capacity to support business surges like Black Friday and the like, as long as the applications are engineered to support them, of course. So moving along to the typical journey to cloud that we see, and how you can look at cost across that journey. So up front, it's important to look at the business case and the drivers for starting a cloud program. Then selecting the right partners to form the foundation. So I will talk about those two sections in particular, and then I'll hand over to Rob later on to talk about architecting cost-effective solutions during that migration program, and then how you manage that on an ongoing basis. So business case planning, what are you trying to achieve from this cloud migration project? It could be that it's a cost drive in order to exit a data center and avoid a large investment cycle. Or it could be that it's an investment to advance the business and take advantage of some of those more indirect benefits that I mentioned earlier on. Understanding your existing costs is important. So in our experience, we see some clients who have very low IT infrastructure run costs, but incredibly high project costs. And usually what we see is that there can be a large amount of operational cost that's being hidden in projects that reoccur on a regular basis. So it's important to look everywhere and fully understand all of the aspects of cost to form an accurate baseline before looking at what a cloud migration might cost you or might save you. Reviewing existing contracts is important, so break clauses and the usual things. It might not be an efficient time to run this project, or there may be specific terms that need renegotiating about migrating to cloud, particularly around software licenses. Operating models change with cloud. So one common misconception we see sometimes is that with a cloud provider, you sometimes still need a managed service provider to sit on top of that and integrate that with your existing IT teams. Moving to Azure to run your infrastructure is not necessarily a direct replacement to a traditional outsource with IBM, and there probably will need to remain a veneer of services on top, either from an external provider or internally to provide a complete IT service. And then plan around investment cycles. So if you just refreshed your data center and there's 5 years deep depreciation left on those assets, it's probably not a good idea to migrate to cloud and lead to the write-off of those assets. It might be worth planning a longer term journey to fit that in an appropriate manner. So next up, about selecting the right cloud partner. Both the partner that will provide your infrastructure and a partner that will help you migrate, and how you can engage with them commercially. So there are 4 cloud providers that dominate the market. So AWS, Azure, Google, and Alibaba. There's, I suppose, increasing parity on the services that they offer, particularly to the enterprise. But also there's some differentiating factors, particularly around areas such as data and AI and analytics that can differentiate them. But also there's a number of niche cloud providers that might suit your business better than one of the major ones. So for example, some software vendors such as Oracle offer their own cloud products, which if you're a heavy Oracle user, may be a commercially effective way to move off on-premise infrastructure as part of an overall negotiation. The gap between the largest providers is closing quite fast. So AWS are the most dominant and have been incredibly strong in the market for some time now. I would say they have the widest breadth of expertise in the marketplace for deploying enterprise solutions into their cloud services. They have quite a large professional services organization themselves as well. Azure have been racing up over the last few years, making use of their large enterprise sales forces that are hooked into probably most large, medium and small organizations in some way who consume the Office suite of products. and has been a great springboard for them to sell on further cloud infrastructure services. And they have a very strong partner network as well. Google are coming up from behind because they focus on technology, being primarily a technology firm, and do have some brilliant features to their products, but haven't really sold them effectively into the enterprise market until probably the last 12 to 18 months. So I'm expecting to see Google sort of starting to move to a position of equaling or maybe advancing ahead of those other providers over the next couple of years. And then finally, so some recent research from Flexera. There's a brilliant report on their state of the cloud that was published a couple of weeks ago. The organisations are not taking advantage of some of the discounting structures that are available from the cloud providers, which can be quite complicated, but can save a lot of money if they're used effectively. So how do you select your cloud provider? So you may choose one or more, I suppose, to start with, and depending on the scope of your project, whether it's a wholesale migration to a particular cloud provider, or if you're an incredibly large organisation and looking to carve it up and maybe have different parts of your workload running with different cloud providers. So we see some interesting things from different industries driving which cloud providers they go with. So, for example, one issue may be around competition. So people in the retail sector may avoid working with a major competitor such as AWS, for example. Similarly, people in the media sector may also look at others as their competitors and perhaps avoid hosting their competing services with them. Another factor in regulated industries such as financial services is around concentration risk and vendor lock-in. So making sure that there isn't too many eggs in one basket with a single provider, even if that's within one organisation or across many organisations. And around vendor locking, making sure that there's an exit strategy, that if something catastrophic was to happen with one of these material outsourcers, essentially, there is a route within a reasonable time to move to an alternative solution. So on the capabilities front, very similar capabilities are available around areas such as automation and tooling across the major providers. I touched on some of the niche providers that may provide unique capabilities. Commercial, we talked around lock-in. So discounts and agreements, you may have an existing agreement with a supplier that you can build on, or a partner who can help with that. And then finally, compliance and security. So some of this comes into where you host your data. So the cloud providers have varying regions and availability zones across different continents and countries. And then, for example, if your data needs to remain within the UK, that might alter the number of cloud providers that can offer that service with the level of resilience that you might require. And then overall, it's important to have some cultural alignment and build an ongoing relationship with this provider, because they will be a material outsourcer who potentially will run a level or underpin all of your IT estate. So a number of different contracting models for cloud services. So the obvious one, pay as you go. Anybody can turn up with their credit card, or perhaps with a bit more structure around it in the enterprise, and pay by the minute or hour or unit for the services they use. So this is amazing, lets you deploy things quickly anywhere in the world, but can add up considerably if it's not managed carefully. Moving to spot resources. So a fundamental shift with cloud providers is, so if you think about your own data center, you buy some infrastructure, and it's up to you how well you use that or not. The spare capacity in there is yours to use. Within the cloud platforms, the spare capacity on the physical infrastructure is there for the cloud providers to sell if they can, and spot resources is one method they use to do that, where you can achieve up to 90% discounts for particular classes of service, as long as you agree to those services potentially being interrupted when the cloud provider requires that capacity back for customers who are essentially paying more money. Reserved resources can offer discounts of probably 40 to 50% where you commit to use a particular type of resource for a longer period of time. This type of model varies across the cloud providers. So Amazon operates on a reserved capacity model. Google has a similar model, but also offers sustained usage discounts. Whereas if you keep the same services running for an extended period of time, the price gets cheaper and cheaper for the longer the period that you run it for. Moving up to, I suppose, those areas applicable more to enterprise customers. So an enterprise agreement, negotiating a fixed level of discount based on the services you're intending to consume. Perhaps sometimes wrapped in with a software licensing agreement, so maybe from someone such as Microsoft or Oracle. It could build on an existing enterprise agreement to include some discounts for compute. And then finally, the pre-commitment. So the pre-commitment deals have been around for the last couple of years now, with some large global organizations making sometimes hundreds of £million commitments over 5 to 7 to 10 years for consumption of cloud services. So these deals are a major partnership for some of these large global organizations, and usually have some benefits wrapped in around investment back from the cloud provider to support kickstarting a migration program to help drive that consumption, or maybe some services and support from their experts in some more of the enhanced products that the cloud providers offer around analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence that can help improve business performance in other areas. So once you've selected your cloud infrastructure partner, or more than one, if it's a large-scale migration program, you probably need support from a migration partner. And you may already deal with someone who perhaps looks after your applications today, or provides a managed service around them that could be this partner to assist the migration. I suppose there's two types of migration to cloud that I touched on earlier. So one is a pure lift and shift, moving what you have today into a cloud platform to get rid of some physical assets or a location. But then also a more transformational approach, where you're changing your applications and services to fit with some of the more, I suppose, magical features of cloud around like containerization or platform services, and more modern ways of architecting applications to make use of the dynamic scaling that cloud platforms can offer, which generally would need some external expertise to get that sort of program up and running on a reasonable timescale to meet your business case. So what you want to look for, their capabilities. So have they done this before? Do they have some references? So certified individuals are important, but certifications can be easy to achieve, and you also need a good balance of expertise and experience in migrating applications to cloud to go with that. And it could be it's highly likely they'll be in partnership with one of the cloud providers already, but we're starting to see an increasing number of deals where customers are wanting the major cloud providers to front a migration program on their behalf and pull together a group of partners to deliver an outcome of a migration to cloud, as well as providing the services. So putting some more of the risk onto the cloud providers, who ultimately are the ones who benefit from long-term revenue by hosting your infrastructure. And then with your migration partner, so opportunities for managing cost around the commercial approaches, which I will go into more detail around some of the suggested options now. So these are a few different models we see for working with a migration partner, and starting off on the left with a time and materials. So where the scope may not quite be understood in the early stage of a program, time and materials could be a good way to carry out some initial planning. Fixed price, so for maybe a larger data center exit program, it could be possible to agree a fixed price contract, to agree for a supplier to deliver a fixed amount of value for a fixed price. But it's important in entering these agreements that that those points I mentioned earlier on in the business case around understanding what the full scope is and what the requirements are and what the complexity is are well agreed up front, and that I suppose the work package that you're looking to wrap in a fixed price is deliverable for that. Gain share. So I guess similarly, a migration project, if there are large savings to be had by exiting a facility, you may want to offer some of those savings as an incentive to your partner to make sure that they hit the deadlines that are necessary to perhaps tie in with a lease agreement or something similar. And then finally, agile. So I guess the word agile is used quite regularly, but it applies in this sense as well. So where there may be an incredibly large scope for a migration program, it might make more sense to break that down into smaller chunks that are estimated and delivered on an iterative basis. And then what we find through that approach is those estimates can become more accurate as the program goes on, and neither party is committing to too much at any one time, and can be quite a productive outcome. So finally on this section, the success factors to look for across this. So making sure your objectives are aligned both with any of the partners that you work with. You want everybody to be pulling together at a common goal and have that commitment. And to get to this stage, it involves putting in the effort up front to understand fully your current costs, what the drivers are, what the challenges may be, and making sure that's appropriately covered in the program. And then finally, having a strong governance framework. So cloud is terms used an evergreen platform. It's constantly evolving and changing, and setting up a 3-year migration program from the start might look quite different towards the end due to the changing nature of services available or regions available or any of the factors that might change. So it's important to have that governance in place so all parties involved in such large programs meet regularly and agree the best course of action across the program. Cool. So next I will hand over to Rob to talk in more detail about architecting cost efficiency.
Thank you, James. So yeah, as James said, we're going to be talking a little bit more in the technical detail now, and some tips and tricks that you can take for planning out your cloud migration or even operating it. So recent bit of research by Jay Chappell, who's CEO of Park My Cloud. He did some analysis over their clients and forecasted that there's going to be around about 13.3 billion in 2020 on wasted cloud spend. And this is predominantly due to things like idle resources and oversized resources, which is up from his estimate of 10.6 in 2019. So the size of the prize is quite large from that perspective. When he did this assessment, he was looking at, well, organizations approximately spend 44% on non-production resources. So these are resources that don't need to be up 24/7 operating all the time. In fact, 76% of the time, those resources are spent idle, so not in use outside of core business hours. So there's a prime opportunity for those non-production resources to be shut down, perhaps even downsized. Certainly when you think about running different types of testing, it might be possible to downsize those resources for different test phases. And then of the clients that he assessed as well, 40% of them had resources that were oversized by at least one size larger than what they needed. And that one size reduction can save up to 50% of cost, and two sizes can be as high as 75%. So it's really important to have a look at when you're looking at resources that you want to spin up in the cloud, making sure that you forecast the right size for those resources. And so to try and help with this challenge of managing costs in the cloud, there's the FinOps Foundation recommend 3 phases. The first, which is informed. So this is building out visibility, allocation of those costs. And I'll talk about some of the methods that we can do that in a moment. But the ultimate goal is enabling the fast delivery of data to make decisions in real time. And then once you've got that baseline, then moving into optimize. So how do organizations optimize the cloud footprint? Look for the right options in cloud provider discounts, right size machines, make sure that the cloud from a cost perspective is operating as optimally as possible. And then operations, so continually evaluating what are the trends in the organization, how can you optimize the rates? And what you'll notice is that this is a combination of people, process, technology. There's not one area that is more prominent in this space. It's a real alignment of all 3. And so what should you plan for? So when you're starting out this journey, what are some of the foundations that you can put in place? Or the term that I quite like from Microsoft is the enterprise scaffold. And so starting right at the start, looking at your subscription and account design. And there's different ways that you can do this, and also apply it to the one that works best for your business. But you can, for example, structure it on workload. You could structure it by types of apps. You might choose to structure it by business unit, but it's whatever gives you the best visibility of how your resources are being deployed. And then taking that to the next level down, absolutely mandatory is to implement a tagging strategy. And so this is essentially adding metadata to the different resources that you spin up. And organizations can do this by a cost center, business unit, or project. But having that really detailed view of what resources there are, how much money they're consuming. There's then the notion of policy. So the tagging strategy can be enforced via policies, where you can dictate that a resource can't be spun up unless someone has declared what the cost center is, or what the business unit is, for example. And then taking that a step further, you can also narrow down what types of machines people can spin up. So if you don't want people spinning up very large instances, you can restrict that, and that might be ideal for test environments, for example. Obviously, plan for software license usage. So if you're using particularly expensive applications, I know Oracle has taken a beating in this webinar, but they are quite expensive when it comes, or can be quite expensive when it comes to cloud. And so definitely having control over how those software licenses are used, where they're deployed, and making sure that the right license for the right environment is applied as well. Because certainly some software vendors will give you development-based licenses, as an example. Plan for dynamic scaling. I mean, one of the big benefits of the cloud is the burst-out capability. And so when you're moving these applications to the cloud, even if you're not transforming them, there might be opportunities if the application is stateless to use things like virtual machine scale sets to scale the demand for the virtual machine. You can do that on any number of different premises, whether it be CPU, memory, or even the number of sessions. Obviously, looking forward, starting to exploit platform as a service and software as a service offerings. So taking away some of that complexity of you having to manage the infrastructure and getting your engineers to focus more on the innovation side of things. So we totally recognize that won't be acceptable for everyone, particularly if you've got very stringent security restrictions. But it's definitely something you should be aiming to exploit. And there's a trend at the moment around green apps or green programming. So taking a think about how you're actually architecting the application, particularly with some of the platform as a service models that you see at the moment, where they're charged on a per API call or per usage. Having particularly chatty applications can really drive up the cost of the underlying cloud resources that you're using. So think about how you can optimize that. Using the lowest cost region. So select your regions very carefully. And there's always going to be an element of certainly around things like data sovereignty, where it might not be, there might not be a choice in the region that you use. But it might be possible for you to perhaps use other regions for things like test environments if you've got an anonymized data set. Automation and tooling, as James said earlier, the cloud providers have come on leaps and bounds in terms of the programmability of the cloud providers, and definitely leveraging the ability to spin up resources. And if you're in a multi-cloud environment, perhaps consider using tools such as Terraform so you standardize that across the patch. And then there's the well-architected framework. So all the cloud providers now have a well-architected framework in one way, shape, or form. And they've got some really good recommendations in there about how you can architect your applications, not just from a resilience or performance perspective, but they're now including cost as one of those pillars. But I guess last but not least, always evaluate the trade-offs. It might not be as simple as you need to save costs. It might be that you need that really highly available chatty application. But make sure that you've done that evaluation and go around and see, is there another opportunity that you can take to reduce that cost? And when you take a step forward, so what should you monitor when you're in the cloud, and how should you build that ethos of continually optimizing? So first one, obviously, shutting workloads down after hours if you can. If there's no need for the workload to be up, and you can monitor that. You can bring in monitoring tools to look at the utilization of services to perhaps inform those decisions. Interesting one, specifying expiration dates. So I certainly know it's very common. Someone comes and asks you, can I have a server or can I have a database because I want to do some testing? And that person does the testing that they want to, and then you never go back and shut it down. So having perhaps in your tagging approach an expiration date for if that server should be shut down after a certain date, or even if it's just a notification to go and check with that person whether they need the resource anymore. Software license compliance. So we spoke about forecasting the use of the software appropriately, but then monitoring it in production is even more important, especially with how easy it is to make copies of virtual machines or reusing machines for different purposes. In most cases, there's going to be a compliance software that you can deploy. It's really just making sure that you keep track of where you're using licenses and using it in the right way in line with what you've agreed with that software vendor. Eliminating inactive storage. So a lot of the cloud providers will offer you storage lifecycle policies. So if there's information that you've not used for the last 180 days, then put it into archive. If you don't need that information on demand, and you can wait for that information to be surfaced if you ever need it. That can reduce costs greatly, especially if you're talking about very large storage volumes. Underutilized discounts. So definitely working with your procurement team, working out, is there another opportunity for you to take on more discounts? Your revenue is going to, or the amount of consumption that you have with a cloud provider is likely to grow over the years. And as that grows, the provider may be able to offer you more discounts. And conversely as well, actually reviewing the utilization. If the amount of resources that you're using are growing, but you can't really understand why, it's a prime opportunity to go in and understand, well, where is that utilization coming from? And that's driven by assuring that you've got the appropriate monitoring and alerting in place. And then by last but no means least, also look for the anomalies. And a good example here is, particularly if you're working with, let's say, serverless applications, if you start to find that you're doing event-based, let's say, that messages are replaying over and over again, that's going to drive up the cost of how many serverless instances that you're driving up. So it's really important that you don't just look at how are things working in a trend-like fashion, but also looking for the oddities that are happening within your application estate. And then lastly, we just thought we'd touch on, well, whose responsibility is all this anyway? Because sometimes it can sound like it's all the engineer's problem or it's all procurement, but it's actually a quite intricate relationship between all of the different parties. So you've got the executives and senior management who really need to set that clear, transparent strategy of where the focus for demand needs to be. And as James said earlier, the move to cloud takes away from that capacity-based model where you could only do as much as however many resources you had in the data center, to now it's actually, I can drive as much demand as I need, but the more demand there is, the more spread resources are going to be. So if you want something doing, setting that really clear focus is really important. And then that comes across to our engineering folk, who should really be treating cost as another metrics like we have for performance or availability. And those engineering teams should be measured, although I prefer to use the term incentivized, on the cost effectiveness of the cloud platform and how, what changes have they made to the cloud platform to make it more cost efficient. And then you've got our FinOps practitioners who are forecasting the cloud spend, ensuring that allocation of cost is actually happening in the right way and the right people are being charged for what they consume. But then also helping forward forecast the budgets for those teams as well. Because taking that forward forecast then into your procurement teams, you can then start to have that really lively debate with the cloud provider that says, over the next 6 months, I expect our utilization to grow by X amount. Is there a discount that we can leverage, or is there something you can do for us to make that more appetizing? So with that, I'm going to hand back to James for some key takeaways.
Thank you, Rob. So I suppose IT services, it's no longer a fixed 3 to 5 year investment cycle of buying and replacing hardware and migrating within a data center. It's become an eternal process where the available services and how you may best deploy something cost effectively is changing on a regular basis. So it's important to have a roadmap that caters for that and keeps an eye on. So when you first migrate something to cloud, it may not be the optimal way of deploying it, but you should plan to continue to optimize that for the life cycle of that service. So determine the outcomes you want for cloud. So I touched on right at the start, an objective may be to avoid a capital infrastructure refresh and lift and shift like for like to cloud, noticing that in the long term may be a more expensive way of operating, or it could be an upfront investment to re-architect totally some of your applications and build a brand new microservice-based platform that fits perfectly into cloud and is infinitely scalable. But for an upfront cost of delivering that to provide benefits you get later down the line. Be creative about how you work with your suppliers and partners and ensure there's a good cultural fit and they're delivering the value you need. Plan effective architectures. So as Rob talked about, there are generally many ways to achieve the same solution. Some of those are cheaper than others. Some of those are more effective than others, depending on the requirements. And also, a subtle difference is that the cloud provides almost infinite capacity, which could lead to almost infinite cost if you don't effectively manage that and plan how much infrastructure you would like to consume in particular scenarios. And then finally, managing cost is everybody's responsibility. So previously it might have been IT who bought the equipment and maybe did a bit of cross-charging. But with the IT and business becoming closer together, with developers in the business working directly on infrastructure and cloud providers, it's something that everybody needs to consider in what they're doing. And with that, we'll move on to some time we have for any questions you might have. So I believe on the right hand side there's a little box where you can type in some questions, and then Calvin will join us to pass those on to us. Thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks, James and Rob, for this very insightful presentation on managing costs while adopting the cloud. I hope that everyone finds this interesting. Thank you for those who have submitted your questions. There are some very good ones. So I'm just going to dive into the first one to you, James. First one will be, will Brexit increase demand for UK-based cloud data hosting?
It's a very good question. So the clients we've been working with, so some UK-based clients have a policy based on the European Economic Area, which we still remain part of. So our for ensuring, I suppose, resilience between cloud provider regions, they're happy for that data to remain within cloud provider regions in the European Economic Area. There are some particular use cases that require data to remain in the UK, which will drive demand for consumption. And it goes back to those factors of choosing the right partner. So some cloud providers have separate, geographically separated regions within the UK, so Microsoft in particular, but those regions don't necessarily offer all of the features that an enterprise might need. Other providers do have some level of geographic separation between availability zones within the same region, but obviously there may not be the same level of control plane separation that you might require, as in having a completely separate data center. Another aspect that we were discussing recently is around what happens in the event of a major cloud provider failure, and particularly in the UK. So if a particular region or availability zone were to fail, and an increasing number of businesses having a multi-cloud strategy, there could be some interesting and unforeseen events that cause spikes in demand or shortages in supply of capacity across a variety of providers. And I think we saw earlier this year Microsoft struggling to meet the increases in demand through the changes in working through COVID and prioritization of those resources to those that needed it most. So yeah, I suppose behind the scenes there still is finite capacity in these data centers, and it's an interesting consideration that you need to make into any migration plan.
Okay, thank you, James. Let's move on to the second one. I think I'll go direct this to Rob. Are we seeing any specific businesses or industry which decided not to move to a public cloud provider because they are unable to make savings, either in the direct or indirect categories that James has mentioned?
There's none that immediately jump to mind. I think seeing organizations not going to cloud because purely based on cost savings, I've not really come across. I think the one that I've probably come across more is the concern around security. I guess I think organizations recognize that there is cost efficiencies to be made. Coming back to James's earlier point, perhaps the reason that they're not doing it right now may be because of the investment cycles. And I guess it's quite an interesting time because some organizations are very likely to be either have potentially just started their investment cycle on an on-premise data center or in the middle of, and so the loss of those assets in terms of accelerating the depreciation might not be acceptable at this time. I don't think I'm seeing anything. I don't know if you've seen anything there, James.
There's a couple of clients I've spoken to who, like you say, it's just not the right time. Their on-prem data centers are quite optimized and are quite cheap to run. But I think looking further ahead into their, I guess, 3 to 5 year roadmap, there may be a point where a decision's made around whether to start to refresh that hardware or move to something different, and also looking at which applications and services they use, or whether they need to maintain custom applications or can move to software as a service alternatives, for example.
Okay, thank you, James, Rob, for the answer. Hopefully this answered the questions. So we'll move on to the third one. There's generally, to James, I would say, there's generally like parallel running costs of running on-prem and cloud during the migration phase. What would be the pragmatic approach, right, in driving the cost more efficiently or driving it down on both ends, given that in real life that might be a bit too unrealistic to turn off on-prem right away?
Yep, it's a very good question, and definitely something to factor into the business case. So we've seen at several clients where perhaps an existing managed service for a data center or infrastructure service has a floor cost to either because that's the commercial construct of the contract, that you will pay IBM no less than 5 million a year, no matter what they do in this space for the term of the contract, or where there is just a minimum level of infrastructure that needs to be managed and operated until the last service has gone. So the network and firewalls and storage platforms and the like. I think it's just planning intelligently the approach to migration. So categorizing the applications, looking at some of the more complicated ones up front and not leaving them to the end. So maintaining a balanced portfolio of services to manage throughout the lifetime of the program. But yes, it is. In some cases, there is no way of avoiding it. It's finding the balance, I think, is the advice there. Any other comments, Rob?
I think the only comment was I always try and challenge it, whether it's possible to turn something off or not. And I think we've seen a few clients as well that would rather do the decommissioning once all of the resources are actually moved to cloud. I definitely think bringing that decommissioning approach as forward as possible and turning things off almost as you move them. It's totally acceptable that you might have like a 10-day or perhaps even a 20-day leeway between migrating something over, doing the cutover before you finally do that decommission. But bringing that decommission forward, I think, in line with the migration is essential to being able to reduce that parallel run cost. Maybe the only build on that is up front, perhaps working with the service management teams to determine what is the switch off criteria, because there's nothing worse than migrating something and saying that it's successful, and then perhaps the service management guys don't feel comfortable. So as a part of the application assessment, definitely make sure that you've got that switch off criteria.
One final thought: factor in the decommissioning costs, because they can add up. If you have a significant amount of physical infrastructure to shred or destroy to meet the requirements of your organization, that can be very expensive and can take a long time, as can be arranging for the legal disposal of electronic equipment.
Thank you both. Hope your questions answered. Just moving on, just hand it to Rob. This is just about cloud migration partners contracting models. What is the typical contracting models do you see in clients go on for their cloud migration journey? So for example, do they go for time materials to do their discovery state on their on-prem state, and then do their gain share models when they go on their migration?
So it's a really good question, and as always, the answer is it depends, because it really depends on the organization. So some organizations that we come across might have a very strong approach to their CMDB and know exactly where all their assets are and what business services are made up of certain infrastructure, which makes the discovery that little bit easier. And so they may have the confidence to perhaps fix price it. Generally, most organizations aren't in that space just yet. And so what we would generally, I guess, see is perhaps a time and materials to land a discovery team to come in and understand the lay of the land, do that assessment of the data center, where the resources are, and start to build up that business service to application to physical infrastructure mapping. And I can't emphasize how important that relationship is for being able to successfully migrate an application. And then once you've got that discovery, then again, depending on the organization, it's normally a selection of fixed price, gain share, or agile. I guess what I would say is, if you're looking at a multi-year migration approach, you probably want to be considering something that's a bit more flexible than a fixed price, because I don't think any business can honestly say, especially over the last year, that they know exactly where they're going to be in 3 years. So I would say, as you approach that migration, really think about whether you would be comfortable committing to a fixed price project. And it goes without saying as well, if you're going, if it's a lift and shift, it might be a little bit easier. If you're doing full scale transformation, and as James said earlier, moving more towards that kind of microservice type architecture and cloud native, then fixed price becomes a lot more difficult, I would say. I don't know if you've got any builds on that, James.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more of an incremental approach to these programs, whereas traditionally, perhaps the data center migration from one outsourcer to another is a fixed price project and happens over a fixed term. The target in that situation is generally quite fixed and well defined, whereas migrating to cloud, the target's changing all the time. So it's important to have, I think, that flexibility for some of these large cloud migration programs.
Cool. Thank you both. We just got on to the last question for the session. And leave out to James and Rob. So the question is, if a customer is a heavy Oracle house that wants to move to the cloud, typically onto the hyperscale clouds, your AWS, Azure, and GCP, what is the alternative? Because moving to those clouds will be quite expensive. So is there any advice you can give?
Yeah, I'll start off on that one. So if an enterprise is a heavy Oracle user, they probably have a very heavy software licensing bill, and it may be best to work with Oracle to see what options they can offer outside of that from their own cloud platform. Outside of that, I think all cloud providers now offer a bare metal alternative to their virtualized platforms, which can be more effective for landing some of the more cost effective for landing some of those traditionally licensed products on the hyperscale cloud platforms. Or I guess the ultimate alternative is planning a longer term migration, perhaps away from those technologies. But that can be significantly difficult given how deep some of those products reach into the business. Do you want to add to that, Rob?
Yeah, you touched on it a little bit there. Taking some of the foundations that we spoke about earlier, it comes back to some of that right sizing thing. So making sure that you're deploying the right size machine for what you need. Certainly within some of the Oracle deployments that I've seen, you have these massive databases with more RAM and CPU than you can shake a stick at, but they're not actually using it. And even if there was a failover scenario, again, you're still not going to be using even 80% of the capacity of that machine. So definitely reviewing that utilization is really key. And then as well as working with the likes of Oracle, also work with the cloud vendors, particularly between Microsoft and Oracle. Now I know that Microsoft and Oracle Cloud went into a partnership to lay very low latency, high bandwidth connections between their data centers, so that you could potentially run Oracle applications in Oracle Cloud and run the front-facing applications in Azure, for example. So there's a lot of options. Again, it's just what's right for your organization.
Thank you both. So yeah, that's the end of the Q&A.
Thank you very much for your time this evening. Some great questions there, and look forward to speaking to you again.